It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the first of this year's Frank Davis Memorial Lectures. This is a series of lectures, a very long-running series of lectures at the Courtauld that I kind of grew up as a master's and then PhD student attending. It was founded over 25 years ago in 1989 in memory of a very regular contributor to Country Life called Frank Davis, unsurprisingly. And after his death, his friends, to commemorate the contribution that he'd made, a very dynamic contribution to art history through the pages of Country Life and his other standalone publications, endowed this distinguished lecture series as a way of bringing to the Courtauld specialists focused on particular fields of study in order to deliver a series of lectures. And this year's series, as you will all know because you're here, is focused on pre-colonial African art. And it's extremely timely for us to have a series of the Frank Davis devoted to this theme because as those of you who attended especially last year's series, which I organized around the theme of decentering art history, you'll know that at the Courtauld we've been thinking very hard about what we can do to expand the canon of our field and to diversify in many ways the kinds of works of art that we consider, and in kind of the briefest way that I can think of putting it is to not be the Courtauld Institute of some art, but the Courtauld Institute of all of the art. And we're doing this in a variety of ways, certainly through the program of the Research Forum, but also through appointments of new faculty members. And I hope most, if not all of you already know that this term we're in the process of recruiting with the very generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, 2 new faculty posts in focusing on African and African diaspora art. This is going to make a really significant contribution to our curriculum and our research base here at the Courtauld. And my colleagues, Suzanne Babayi and Scott Nethersole, who've coordinated this series of the Frank Davis Memorial Lectures, have done so, I think, as I think Suzanne may say herself, really motivated by the desire not just to think about a kind of expanded curriculum in which we place Africa and South Asia and Persianate art and the Southern Hemisphere more to the center of what we do, but also to think about pre-modern art histories alongside the modern. And so this series comes at this very kind of critical moment for us and is an opportunity not just to think about modern and contemporary art, but African and African diasporic art, but to think about pre-modern art as well. And so I'm very grateful to Scott and Suzanne for organizing this series, and as with all of the first lectures of Frank Davis, we begin with a double introduction. So I introduce the whole series, and I'm also going to introduce you to Suzanne, who will then introduce our speaker in some kind of, ancien regime, kind of complicated, formal way. But it does give me the opportunity to thank Scott and Suzanne for the amount of work that they've put into thinking through this series and the events surrounding it, and to welcome you all to the Courtauld. So now I hand over to Suzanne. So thank you, Suzanne.
Well, thank you, Alex. This is a most exciting turn of events at the Courtauld for us, for our students, and indeed for the whole community that is connected to us, to be welcoming 4 extraordinary scholars whose focus of research and writing has been on the arts of Africa and its diasporas, but especially in a pre-colonial context for the most part. My task is to introduce this speaker, and I'm going not to take more time than what I need to in order to give her the chance to take advantage of the time we have. At the end of her lecture, we invite you to join us for drinks, at which point you can ask her questions and meet her in person. And here we go. Cécile Fromont, who is an associate professor at the History of Art Department of Yale University and has made a very long journey for us, for which we are very grateful to you, and indeed wish to welcome you warmly to this evening. Her research and writing focus on visual material and religious culture of Africa and Latin America, which is itself a very telling aspect of a sort of a global way of thinking about Africa as well, with the early modern period as her primary focus, and then to that added the Portuguese-speaking Atlantic world, about which, or a portion of that, is the topic of tonight's talk. Cécile has, I invite you to recheck the site under her name for tonight, to check her very distinguished biography, including a book, her first book, The Art of Conversion, Christian Visual Culture in the Kingdom of Congo, which was published in 2014 by the University of North Carolina Press. It looks like everyone in the field of art history and beyond was competing to give this book a prize. It's an amazing list of prizes that this book has won. We should have given you a prize too, but here we are. So she's an extremely prolific author and researcher, and has published very widely on African and Latin American arts, and indeed has received a vast number of prestigious grants and residencies and so forth in order to finish all these works, including most recently in 2018, a Rome Prize Fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Before I welcome Cécile and remind us of her talk, which is a really interesting text-based sort of approach to start with on this early modern Portuguese-speaking Atlantic world and its links to Africa. I want to also make a note of the fact that she is giving a series of lectures at UCL, which take place between 3rd and 5th of December. Though it is not here, we would like to encourage you to join her lectures at UCL. We are good sister institutions. So on that note, may I ask you to join me in warmly welcoming Cécile to deliver the first of this Frank Davis lecture series.
Thank you so much. Does this need to be switched? No? You're good. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for the invitation and for coming. I'm delighted to be here and quite excited to share some new research on the early modern Portuguese Atlantic worlds. Let me see. I'll start my stopwatch. Here we go, and have a sip of water. All right, so on the screen, 1731, trial of José Francisco Pereira, black man, slave of João Francisco Pedroso, born in Ouida on the Mina coast and resident of the city of Lisbon. Tightly bound and stitched, duly labeled and dated, a 123-page Inquisition trial record captured the story of José Francisco. The Holy Office of Lisbon detained the enslaved African man in the early summer of 1730 on charges of witchcraft for making and selling amulets. At the center of the inquiry was this set of ink-on-paper compositions that the tribunal seized from the man and duly archived in the pages documenting the proceedings. creased from being once folded into small rectangles to fit into pouches, similar to these two examples. The pages contain a mix of drawings and alphabetic markings that José Francisco composed by enlisting the penmanship of a European youth. These pieces of paper were the key ingredient in the empowered packet the African man made and marketed, a kind of object known in the 18th century Portuguese-speaking world as bolsas de mandinga, or mandingo bag in a literal translation. Men and women of all ethnic and social backgrounds, from Rio de Janeiro to Lisbon, but also as far away as Portuguese India, used these bolsas. Yet it was specialists of African origins or descent who masterminded the packets. They trained in Brazil through apprenticeship the art of creating, locating, and assembling the empowered materials that they put together into individualized objects of either or both protection and action. Some of the bolsas assisted in their matrimonial, romantic, or sexual pursuits. Others protected the enslaved against the abuse of their masters. Most, however, served as spectacularly efficient shields against physical vulnerability, with the ability to stop metal implements from penetrating the body. So we have in the Inquisition trials and elsewhere numerous awestruck testimonies of Africans and Europeans alike that describe how knives, swords, or even bullets from firearms literally bounced off the skin of bolsa wearers. These bolsas have called the attention so far of mainly historians who all duly noted their cross-cultural dimensions, made evident, they argued, by the itineraries of their makers across African, indigenous, and European milieus. Yet those feats of microhistory stumbled at the analysis of the bolsa's connections with multiple cultural realms. In particular, the ostensibly European designs and material of the bag's makeup gave them pause. They judged that the reference they may have made to multiple visual, religious, and symbolic sources were broad and vague and would remain elusive to firm identification and let alone analysis. Others have confronted the packet as thinly veiled syncretic versions of entirely African practices, as testaments of cultural retention through the Middle Passage, and early, still amorphous examples of a yet-to-come Afro-Portuguese or Afro-Brazilian culture. As an art historian, I argue in contrast that a close attention to the bolsa's forms, mode of creation, and use does allow for a culturally and historically specific discussion of their sources, modus operandi, and impact. In fact, visual and material analysis set in the context of 18th century slave trade, I argue here, not only shed light on the packet, but also reveal the deep and mutually transformative connections that transoceanic commerce created between Africans and Europeans on the realms of the material and the spiritual. Far from simple, stealthy objects, from oppressed subjects hiding their gods behind the semblance of their masters, the bolsas were the products of the sustained, if often abruptly asymmetrical dialogue that the Atlantic slave trade sparked between people along the two-continent coast, Africa and Europe, and beyond in the Americas. But first, some definitions. The idiom bolsa de mandinga refers etymologically to the West African Mande-speaking people that we know under the different names of Mandingo, Mandinka, or Malinke. And it's a people who is known for their use of Islamic-inspired amulets. Yet, by the time the bolsas became a widespread and specific practice in the 18th century, the word mandinga in that particular context, when used in conjunction to the packet, was completely disconnected to ethnogeographic connotations and expressed instead the idea of supernatural control and efficacy. So you would find the word in phrases such as, oh, I had this amulet and it worked, so it was mandinga. And the neologism mandingueiro was then used to talk about the people making those amulets. These bolsas first appear in the historical record in the late 17th century. The earliest Inquisition trial that we have dealing with them dates back from the 1690s. But it was really in the first decades of the 18th century that mentions to them become more evident in the inquisitorial documents. And these mention came from a decree, an edital in Portuguese, that mandated their denunciation to the Inquisition. So if you knew about them, you had to tell the Inquisition. But of course, that mandate came because they were more widespread at the time. But this period-specific dimension of the bolsas make them objects crafted at the height of the slave trade and molded in a mature Luso-Atlantic world, a world that joined distant locales into a defined space of shared cultural manifestations created by and fostering the circulation of people, objects, and ideas. In fact, Africans became mandingueiros along a multiple-step transoceanic migration during which they received training and knowledge from interlocutors of diverse backgrounds. Contemporary users of mandingas acutely perceived their transregional dimensions, and clients in Lisbon, for instance, specifically sought ingredients and mandingueiros recently arrived from Brazil. So we have a couple examples left in the Inquisition archives. This one is from a 1704 inquest concerning a certain Jacques Viegas, who was born in West Africa and was accused of witchcraft and recourse to magic. This other example is from 1749, and it belonged to a widow in Madeira who used it to find a new husband. And as you know, being a widow in 18th century Portuguese world was a moment of vulnerability, so she really needed help to become attached to a new patriarchal group. In her case, we still have the cloth and the string that she wore, and inside is the paper. And then when you unfold the paper, you have the formula on the first page there. The little pebbles, and you can see the traces of powder in the middle there, and they're probably pieces of altar stones. And then on the other side, the brown rectangle of where it rubbed against her skin more prominently. And that's a type of amulet in the Portuguese world. That is what is referenced at the top there in ink on paper. We also know of the bolsas through watercolors by Italian-born Portuguese army officer called Carlos Julian, who illustrated them as worn in Brazil by a full range of people in the last quarter of the 18th century. The images do not only seize the use of the bolsas, but also provide a sense of the high incidence of the practice that, though discussed in many documents, is only recorded in a few instances compared to the practice. Here we see the bolsas worn around the neck or at the waist. And of course, all of the pouches that we see may not be bolsas de mandinga. They could be coin purses, tobacco pouches, but also scapulars, in particular the square one around the neck. But that, in fact, is not only, that ambiguity is not only a matter of retrospective analysis, it's also a matter of their quiet and potentially subversive use as a tool of protection and empowerment by the enslaved and otherwise oppressed. The same ambiguity also allowed the members of the elite to turn a blind eye to the notorious presence of the bag. They could pretend not to recognize them when they're slaves and were using them, and they could pass them as orthodox things when they found themselves in need of their object's support. And so this ambiguity reflects the complex nature of mandinga's social character. The pouches were both highly visible and inconspicuous, omnipresent yet theoretically forbidden. They were crafted by people at the bottom of the social and political hierarchies that organized the early modern Portuguese world, yet they were objects of universally recognized and feared power. In this regard, the bolsas make apparent how the definition of the nature and source of power, and beyond this, its exercise, were embattled fields in Portugal and its overseas possession, even if the Portuguese state and church claimed them as their prerogative. The bolsas put to work for their owners invisible forces to visible results. In other words, they exercise power defined as the ability to mobilize immaterial means to achieve visible results. As such, they threatened and engendered the wrath of church and state alike. The two institutions consequently strived to neutralize them. The Inquisition decree mandating denunciation of their users and the trials that ensued were attempts to tame the empowered object. The Holy Office's proceedings transformed the bolsas into evidence and inert archival remains in their files, while discursively reframing the supernatural transactions that went into their making and use as devil-inspired and actionable offenses. Inquisition officers shackled them within paper bundles sealed with wax. They stitched and bound bolsas between the pages of, between the pages of trial records, and reframed them with legal and religious formulae inscribed in ink on paper. Remarkably, in order to assuage its anxieties about the disruptive power of the bolsas, the Inquisition turned to gestures of performative catharsis, an act of symbolic accumulation strikingly similar to that of the object it fought. The concern of the authorities only underlines the bolsa's firm place in the spiritual and social economy of Portuguese societies, a success derived from their ostensible ambiguity and position at the intersection of European and non-European material and magical religious cultures. In their designs and contents, the bolsas called upon and channeled almost exclusively Portuguese esoteric material and symbols. Yet Portuguese and Africans alike turned to them as potent complement or substitute to European amulets. And clients had particular faith, as already mentioned, in the specific efficacy those who had recently journeyed across the Atlantic could impart to their packets. Crafting objects of European makeup and Afro-Atlantic agency, Menjingueiros created with their bolsas sites of cross-cultural combination and creative reinvention. Finding, mixing, and activating ingredients and symbols, they pondered about, reckoned with, and reinvented in both concrete and abstract ways the form, meaning, and nature of power, as well as the mode of mobilizing it. With the particular case of José Francisco, the Inquisition left us an opportunity to trace how African and European designs, materials, and conceptions of the supernatural flowed together in the creation of a particular set of bolsas. The Inquisition recorded him as a natural or born in Ouida, after the port of the West African so-called slave coast, where he was caught in the Atlantic slave trade at the age of 13 or 14. So we're looking at this region here and Ouida. If we zoom in, perhaps I have here we go. Ouida is here, slightly inland. In a longer version of this essay, I outline the specific origins of José Francisco in Bay-speaking territories of the so-called slave coast, and his coming of age as a Vodun devotee. And I also describe the spiritual environment of his childhood, including Fa divination, about which we know quite a bit thanks to a really heteroclite range of documents and objects. And here is a 1650, well, at least collected in 1650, a divination born from Ifa, that is now in the Ulmer Museum. And at the top here, you have Legba, the god of divination, with the bundles on his forehead. But although men and women from varied parts of Africa crafted and intervened in the construction and use of the bolsas, including the one José Francisco used and sold, his resonated through him with the specific ideas, practices, and religious sensibilities of a man born and raised in Ouida circa 1700, enslaved in Brazil, and captured in Lisbon by the Inquisition. So we have both a broad practice and then the opportunity through this example to think about that broad practice from a particular standpoint. So working within, if often against, Portuguese society, José Francisco and his fellow mandingueiros selectively drew from the material, visual, and religious environment of the world around them as they composed their packets. They sought the numinous power of whole or parts of Catholic consecrated objects, such as holy hosts, purificators, or pieces of altar stones. They also counted on the potential of ingredients of ambiguous nature, origin, so that challenged human senses and pointed to the limits of their abilities to comprehend the natural world and its course. So their bags could contain lead that is heavier than it looks, sulfur that is feels organic but is really mineral, but also thunderstone, those Neolithic tools that appears fully formed after a storm, for example, in both Brazil, Europe, and Africa. They also used the kinds of fully made amulets as the coins at the bottom there, and pieces of a Catholic paraphernalia. So the sanguineo cloth, the purificators which used to wipe the chalice after Catholic Mass, presumably would be used to soak up the blood, right? Protect the body, or sangue in Portuguese. These ingredients varied from pouch to pouch, but ink on paper was the essential and in some cases the sufficient component for the amulets. In 1743, Antonio Mascarenhas, a slave from Angola who learned the art of the bolsas in Rio de Janeiro, was asked to describe the first mandinga he ever saw. It was, he answered, and I quote him, a paper. And it's in the third, person as typical of the Inquisition trial. So it was a paper that he said was of mandinga with various designs painted in red ink, among which were an image of Christ our Lord crucified and a mask, cajanca, in the form of a person's face and many other things like trivets and grates and other designs. And here, by mask, is using the word that is used for ships, figureheads, and fountain spouts, not an African mask, as we might want to infer. What is striking at first in his description of the bolsas, from the perspective of a novice African, is his highlight of the role of paper, a material associated in many cultures on the continent with numinous power. What is that object he received? It is a paper, and it is a paper holding various designs. Mentions of geometric elaborations, a crucifixion scene, and the enigmatic reference to the design of a grotesque face, the mask, talk to the repertoire of visual references available to the recently enslaved man. Select Christian iconography was part of his imagery in the form of the crucifix, while what was probably a skull and bone motif made sense to him as a naval figurehead or an architectural feature. And both, of course, ships and fountains were a really important place of sociability for the enslaved. His evocative comparison of the designs to trivets and grates in turn spells a link between the two-dimensional geometric patterns and ironwork. And this is an example of the kind of furniture, right, ironwork that the enslaved would have seen in the Portuguese world. Iron, also, we duly note, is a physically and metaphorically potent material in Africa, Europe, and the Americas alike. The reference to ironwork also tells us much about the types of designs in mandinga papers beyond the few examples that are left. 17th and 18th century Portuguese decorative window grates or forge furnishings reinforce the stylistic contours of mandinga designs as linear and geometric patterns. They also make explicit the parallel that Antonio drew between ironwork and ink drawing in a fluid consideration of the connection between two- and three-dimensional form. The Inquisition file does not record Antonio explicitly mentioning writing in his description, but he clearly noticed it on the page as he sought the help of a student in Madeira to reproduce the bolsa. The enslaved had numerous opportunities to experience the power of words on paper in their journey through the worlds Europeans dominated. Words on paper, they were told in church, made the numinous audible. Directly and violently, words on paper changed lives when ink on a baptismal record altered one's name, or on the sales contract changed one's owner and the entire horizons of one's lived circumstances. That written and spoken words had complementary power in the view of mandingueiros also appears in some of their activation rituals. For the mandinga to be really powerful, Antonio added, echoing many of his colleagues, you have to put it between the altar stone and the altar cloth so that mass would be said over it. Thus, the nature of ink on paper as a mode of inscription, a way to capture the otherwise elusive or transitory, devout incantations, ideas, identity, or change itself, did not escape the mandingueiros, who may have been inspired in part by practices prevalent on the African continent. They also harnessed the potential of lines on paper even beyond alphabetic writings as indexical markers. The use, for instance, of signatures, sometimes of blood from their clients, in echo to Portuguese administrative apparatus. Once more, the shared visual and ritual vocabulary between mandingas and the Inquisition appears in the José Francisco's file, itself ritually sealed and personalized with shaky crosses that the African man repeatedly had to trace on the minutes of his confession. So that's an example of his signature, the cross there. And going back here, the parts that are lighter colored, that are brownish, are presumably blood from the owner of the mandinga. But beyond the power of words and inscription, the ink on paper designs of the bolsas themselves demonstrated elaborate cross-cultural reckonings about the power of two-dimensional form. In this page from one of the bolsas, for instance, we recognize from the outset the Caravaca cross at the bottom of the page with its characteristic double horizontal lines, bars. The Iberian object is a type of reliquary of the true cross that formed, as did the bolsas, an empowered container. The metaphor carried over to the use of pieces of altar stones that were key ingredients in the packets. And the altar stones are liturgical objects in which Mass is said, and they all have a cavity for relics of saints that activate the altar stone, that make its power present there. They also used imagery from medals that were used in the Portuguese world. The arma Christi is one of the prevalent symbols there. The shape of the heart-shaped medals to the right is also echoed in some of the designs. And then, of course, the coat of arms of the Portuguese crown that circulated through coins, and some of those coins also served as amulets. And it seems that paper itself was used three-dimensionally. Here, for example, the designs on the back, these feathers crossing, are meeting exactly at the line of the cross. So it seems that there was an interest in paper being an object as well as a site for inscription. This play on dimensionality further appears in the use of feathers in the designs. Feathers were essential offerings in fa divination in the Vodun realm, as well as other African ritual traditions, and could very well have been one of the drawn ingredients. As the medals were drawn on the paper, maybe the feathers was the drawn ingredient. But they are also the point of the paper where dimensions explicitly collapse. At the time of its making, the flat drawing encompassed the third dimension in the form of the quill, and a fourth in the gesture of tracing. The repetitive, attentive movement necessary to the production of the intricate designs demonstrate that the mandinga papers were as much about their making as they were about their contents. Tracing was a prominent religious technique in Vodun, used in fa divination and other rituals to invoke the presence of the deities through gestures and patterns of protection. Here, a ritual practitioner portrayed in early 19th century Brazil demonstrates such powerful apotropaic gesture and the multidimensional protection it brought its users. The poised and elegant man that the French artist labeled black fetisher stands firmly on the ground and uses a large stick in his right hand to encompass himself in a clockwise circle. That is a trace on the ground, a gesture being performed, and a column of protection. This folding and unfolding of objects into lines and of trace into space, this projection from drawing to protecting, is at the core of José Francisco's bolsas. This expansive, and in his case, Vodun-derived understanding of visual forms as efficacious invocations of numinous presence also encompasses the other designs, the cross, the arma Christi, the esoteric writings and prayers. This mode of thinking is what art historian Dana Rush attributes to what she calls Vodun's unfinished aesthetic. Vodun's unfinished aesthetic is what allows initiates to treat something newly seen as something already known, because images and gods, visual stimulus, and divine presence operate in close concert. There is, in her words, a process of infinite aesthetic and spiritual synesthesia. It is a process in which visual impact in an infinite range of possible forms can produce godly presence. Initiates like José Francisco's are the ones who may recognize and channel that visual impact. They are the ones who have the power to make powerful images, but also to make images powerful. This idea of Vodun's unfinished aesthetics is a key to grasp, if not to understand, the drawings in the bolsas. Instead of attempting to decipher them as coded, maybe disguised African designs, we can rather interrogate what these, after all, mostly European motifs evoked to José Francisco, and how they brought him the real security he felt upon invoking them. As he marketed that sense of security to his clients, he also stretched the perimeter of both Vodun's and Christianity's numinous realms. Vodun found itself enticed by Christian designs, while Catholic symbols became seats for the power of Vodun. Even in their minimal form as a single piece of paper, bolsas remain decidedly material objects. the varied ingredients mandingero combined not only joined the casual or metaphorical force into an empowered single packet, but also changed in nature and became mandinga, that is to say, efficacious in a specific sense. The transmutation at work here is ontological, in that the ingredients change in kind from scraps of Portuguese religious, visual, and material environments to single objects of fierce and trustworthy might. This form of conversion is both material transmutations, ingredients combined into a new metamorphosed whole, and psychological transformation, ushering makers and users from powerlessness to security. For slaves like José Francisco, born and raised to near adulthood in West Africa, the bolsas provided the same tenuous but essential recourse against danger and misfortunes that other packets in the Atlantic world did. For example, Bo empowered object that protected his kin and kith in Dahomey and neighboring regions. Similar processes of accumulation, transformation, and binding linked the two categories of object at a formal level, as did the psychological catharsis that gestures of piercing, binding, knotting, as well as material accumulation may have offered. The example on the screen is a later object, or it's undated, so all we know is it was collected in the 20th century, but we have copious descriptions of this object from the 17th and 18th century in their African context. Similar goals and creation processes also strikingly echo the empowered packets of the people of West Central Africa from the Luango coast in Congo and then Angola and their interiors, which is the other main regions of origins for men and women enslaved in Brazil and Portugal. So we're talking about two completely different and not in contact regions of the African continent. So this is an observation that rightly warns against attempt at a monocultural reading of the bolsas. But it also brings to the fore an essential dimension of the practice. The two regions were in fact connected in the 17th and 18th century by their common experience of the destabilizing effects of the slave trade and its transformative social and cultural consequences. Bo in Dahomey, Minkisi in Central Africa, and the bolsas de mandinga in Brazil and Portugal can all be seen as quintessential objects of the early modern Atlantic, struck on the cross-cultural anvil of slave trade violence, long-distance material exchange, Christian proselytism, and the cultural transformations that they collectively engendered. Bo from West Africa and Minkisi from the Congo, and especially their anthropomorphic versions, are two categories of objects that are at the core of the canon of African art history. And both are considered among the most authentic examples of African artistic expressions. If you think about an African object, oftentimes that would be the kind of things that would come to mind. Yet these kind of objects are seldom approached historically as the product of Africa's interaction with the broader world, and rather are presumed to originate in a distant Africa and still too often presented as the untouched heart of darkness. The view from the stark and really theatrical scenography of the immensely popular 2011 exhibition of Dahomey and Bo at the Cartier Foundation in Paris kind of speaks volumes in this regard, where you had the Bo from Dahomey kind of floating in this really gorgeous setting without even labels or context. They just existed. And it did justice to their visual impact. But lost to that presentation is any kind of historical or cultural specificity. Another shot. Seen historically, however, Bo, Minkisi, and bolsas are all instruments created or recreated in response to the slave trade, understood as a battle of witch against witch. Witchcraft was the concept that West and Central Africans alike turned to in order to make sense of the departure of their brethren from the continent. The disappearance of bodies across the waters took narrative form on the African Atlantic rim in stories of the cannibalistic appetite of the nefarious human flesh-eating witches that were slave traders. A 17th century Central African witness to the beatification proceeding of Jesuit Pedro Claver, that was active in South America, recalled his despair when forced aboard the white man's ship to be brought, he was certain, and I quote his testimony, to their own country where they brought the blacks to kill them and make the flags for the ships from their remains, for when the flags were red, it was from the blood of the blacks, end of quote. And I bring in a print of Black Bart, the famous pirate, and his flag that was and is actually at port in Ouida in this particular print, to kind of think of one of the many ways in which those ideas would have been reinforced. And this is intentionally blank. So with the slave trade, the meaning of malevolence was completely transformed in these regions of the African continent, from imbalances that fit within a set frame of political, social, and familial change to deeply transformating events instigated by Europeans, war, famines, displacement, the slave trade itself, events that threatened and often shattered the established cosmological order. The predatory actions of the Europeans perpetrated for their benefits were, in this view, the acts of antisocial wrongdoers who made immaterial forces work in their favor. Under the same circumstances, in the same period, Europeans turned to the notion of witchcraft in close conjunction to the neologism of fetish that is coined in the same historical and geographic context to approach African religious practices. The terms witchcraft and fetish framed the rituals and objects Europeans observed on African coast, first as inspired by the devil and later as irrational and lacking in sophistication. This conceptual turn would prove lasting and immensely influential in European approaches to the continent, in which historical notions of witchcraft and fetishism loomed large. Africanist historians and anthropologists have been mounting evidence countering such ideas of witchcraft, and fetishism for that matters, as an ancestral feature of African societies, in favor of a definition of the notions and associated objects and practices as historically produced by the slave trade. So the bow, the bolsas, minkisi, provide a potent material dimension to their argument, betraying in their components their cosmopolitan dimension and historically specific origins. Mixing trade cloth, iron chains, mirror, even Catholic paraphernalia for some, these objects led the African counterattack against the most virulent form of witchcraft that was the slave trade. And thus witchcraft led to witchcraft. This dialectic of attack and counterattack is exactly what is at play in the creation of the bolsas and the capture of their makers in the Inquisition. The pouches are objects born from the religious, material, and spiritual interconnections that the slave trade itself created. They were composed to reach, harness, and control invisible powers against the elements produced in a world governed by the predatory rules of European witchcraft. In turn, the Inquisition recognized and attempted to control the bolsas with the shackles of its own ink-on-paper machinery of filing and archiving, its own cathartic gestures of wrapping, stitching, binding, and its own brand of manipulation of the supernatural through confessions, autodafés, and punishment. José Francisco was saved from burning at the stake thanks to his confessions. He was condemned instead to a public confession, flogging, 5 years in the galleys, and to wear for the rest of his life the San Benito distinctive garment of those the Inquisition condemned. And this is a drawing by Goya of one of those in 1810. José Francisco finally disappears from the record after his liberation from forced labors 2 months early. Left behind are his stories and the pages he designed to seek and sell empowerment in the face of enslavement and disenfranchisement. Along with his fellow mandingueiros caught in the cross currents of the Atlantic world at the height of the slave trade, José Francisco performed in crafting his pouches elaborate forms of visual, material, and symbolic transmutation, changing scraps of the Portuguese material and visual environments into elements of protection, capturing empowered signs and charms into lines of ink on paper. Mandingueiros performed the profound and generative reflections on their social, material, and spiritual horizons, and on the means they could mobilize to inflect them and to find empowerment and security of both body and spirit. One of the few African-conceived material remains directly linked to the slave trades, the bolsas bear witness in their composition, use, and afterlives in the hands of the Inquisition to the multivalent connections that the trade engendered between Europeans and Africans along the two-continent coasts and beyond in the Americas. Common concerns produce similar answers, not least newly defined or redefined notions of witchcraft, and more broadly, conceptions about the nature of power and its multivalent entanglement with the material world. Thank you.